Hello everyone. Thank you all for coming to our conference cycle called Homme Territoire Société, which aims at welcoming each month a researcher working on humanities in and about Indonesia. So this evening our guest lecturer is Dr. Gilles Brocard from the University of Grenoble. So Gilles Brocard is a geologist specialized in the evolution of the Earth's surface and active tectonic faults. His research grounds led him to the French Alps, Turkey, Guatemala, and now Palu, where his field investigations were conducted in collaboration with Jean-Philippe Guaran from the University of Lyon, Professor Oumar Syoukour from Tadulako University in Palu, and Dr. Ella Meilyanda and Dedi Alfian from the Tsunami and Disaster Mitigation Research Center in Banda Aceh. Before we start, I would like to thank our partners, the French School for Asian Studies, also known as FAO, who co-organized the events, and also the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development, also known as IRD, who provide technical assistance. And now, please give a warm welcome to Gilles Brocard.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight to this talk. I had the chance to go to Palu for the first time last year, about a month and a half after the event. It was actually only my first time in Indonesia. I had been working on similar faults as the fault we will see, mostly in Guatemala. And I conducted this research owing to the help of the people from the TDMRC in Banda Aceh, who organized the trip from Banda Aceh where we were working at the time. What I'm going to show you is not specifically our work, it's the work of a lot of researchers. And this knowledge that you are going to see is likely to evolve over the next few years as we understand better what happened during that earthquake. So, very soon after the earthquake, there was an international scientific response, but also a national one, which was very strong. So several Indonesian institutes deployed boats to map the seafloor and conduct investigations on land. And we went there and worked together with teams located in Singapore, the King's College London, and independently from us, we had many other teams coming to Palu, Japanese, Turkish, German. And some researchers never came to the field, they just worked with satellite images and seismographs from around the world, and they were able to gather very interesting information just working on these data. So, just something about the title, I said it's a surprising catastrophe, and it is in many ways, and I want to show you what is so surprising in Palu. So, most of the processes that usually kill people during earthquakes didn't kill anyone or almost anyone in Palu, but other phenomena that are pretty uncommon were very important in Palu for explaining people death. So we are going to review what's happening through an earthquake normally and what is the vulnerability of the city of Palu to these specific aspects of the earthquake. So I will walk you through the different aspects of the earthquake. We will start with the rupture on the fault itself. So the slip, what are the characteristics of this slip, and how did it affect Palu? So Palu is one of the few cities in the world that has the bad luck of having a very large active fault crossing the city center. This is very exciting for geologists, but much less so for people, of course. And then the ground shaking is what usually kills people, and we'll see what is specific about ground shaking in Palu. And we will see how it damaged infrastructures, and we will see what it did to the natural environment in the form of landslides, in particular, on land, and at sea, because this earthquake triggered a tsunami, and this was pretty unexpected. So I will start by showing you the faults and giving you a little bit of context. So, as you know, Indonesia is endowed with the largest number of active volcanoes in the world, and it has also very large subduction zones located here and there. And these are places where the Indian Ocean seafloor is passing below Indonesia, And same here with the Philippine sea floor, which is passing below the Philippines and the northern part of Indonesia. And in the meantime, Indonesia is moving towards Australia, and Australia is rushing to the north, and they are both colliding in Irian Jaya and in Timor. So this creates a very complex situation with a lot of earthquakes. The largest earthquakes occur here along the trenches, and you know that they can be of magnitude 9 or higher. And yet, along this subduction zone, surprisingly, the most death related directly to ground shaking due to earthquake is not due to these large trenches, it is due to earthquakes occurring within the islands, close to the volcanoes. And these actually, over the long time, are responsible for more death than the big earthquakes occurring along the plate boundaries. And the Indonesia is made of two parts. There is a part here which is rather rigid, which is not deforming too much. And then we have parts on the side here that are deforming extremely quickly. And so we have active faults within this, which are actually very dangerous. So the most dangerous is probably the Great Sumatra Fault, because it is very long, and it is passing through many populated areas. And just like the Palu-Koro fault that we will see in a minute, it is a vertical fault. And it is located on land. That means that it actually intersects the ground surface. So you can have a house just right against the earthquake, where the earthquake takes place. So it is very dangerous. And vertical faults like that go straight from the surface down to 30 kilometers, generally. And they allow for two blocks to pass each other, just sliding side to side. And so in the case of the Great Sumatra Fault, basically this coastal sliver here is moving north with respect to this more central part. The Palu-Koro Fault is smaller in length here, but it is moving twice as fast. So because of that, it is producing more earthquakes over time. And the function of this fault is to allow for North Sulawesi to ride over the sea in the north and to pass by the stable Kalimantan here. So we know that because the place has been instrumented for a long time. And what the points that you see here are GPS points, so GPS antennas, that are used by geologists to measure the displacement of the ground over the years. And what you see as arrows are the displacement of these points with respect to this one, and they show the displacement of this northern block past the Makassar Strait. And Palu happens to be just there. So here is the Palu-Koro Fault, crossing the city of Palu and going south. So just from the velocity at which the fault is moving, which is 4 centimeters per year, we know that it is able to produce an earthquake of the magnitude of the earthquake last year every 50 years for a 7.5. And for a magnitude 7.2, it's only every 20 years. So there is a very high risk for the city. But because the city is fairly recent, or has been growing to be a sizable city only in recent times, this problem maybe was not considered as sharp as it is before. And as a matter of fact, before the earthquake, we didn't even know where the fault was passing through the city. And sure, now we know, because the rupture of the 28th of September is here, showed here in red. And what happened that day is that the fault had been locked for a long time. The last large earthquake was in 1964, and we know very little about this earthquake actually. And so the two blocks had been moving, but were not slipping past one another. And this is because there was some friction somewhere on the fault, which prevented it from moving. And the point of friction was here. And the fault was almost ready to go, but it was still blocked. And then on that day at 3 p.m., there was a smaller earthquake, a magnitude 6.1, which basically stressed more this point of friction and forced it to yield. And from there, the rupture started and unzipped the fault to the south, crossing the city of Palu. And this unzipping was extremely fast, about 4 to 5 kilometers per second. And this is called the super shear earthquake. It is a very rare type of earthquake. This velocity of unzipping is very uncommon. And to unzip at this velocity, you need to have a very smooth fault plane. And so the rupture just rushed to the city, clean through this eastern side, and then continued for 180 kilometers total. And then, within 3 minutes of the earthquake, we had a tsunami ravaging the coastline here, and we had large landslides represented here by the stars that struck the countryside and urban districts within Palu. So that's a lot of events for an earthquake. So here is the picture taken about here, which shows the fault at the surface in town. So what you see here is a street that has been displaced. So the block at the front here has been moving to the right, and the one in the back has been moving to the left. And the total displacement is 4 meters. And the velocity of the displacement has been about 1 meter per second. So this offset was made in 4 seconds, basically. So the houses that were built on top of the fault were torn apart, all destroyed, of course. And there is no amount of engineering that can save houses located on a fault like that. Even a bunker would not resist. So now that we know where the trace is, it is better to plan the development of the city and avoid building on top of the fault zone. As you see, it is mostly lateral displacement, but along the fault you also have a little component of vertical displacement on either side. And in the city of Palu, the western side has been sinking 80 centimeters, which is not very important if you are far from the seashore, but when you are at the beachfront, that means the ground has been going farther down in the sea. And what you see here is my colleague Jean-Philippe Guaran, who is pointing to the high tide water mark. So this is how high the water used to go before the earthquake. So the ground in the back has been completely stripped by the tsunami. That's why you have no houses. But before you had houses all over the place, you had a restaurant on top of a fish tank. But if it stays barren, it's because due to the sinking of the ground, the high tide is now up here. So that means that all the coastal area is now inundated at high tide. And so here is what it looks if you move 140 meters inland behind the buildings, so pretty far from the coastline. This is the high tide, the sea at high tide. So now you have to cope with this permanently in the city. So that's for basically the geometric effect in itself. Now if we look at the shaking was very interesting because normally earthquakes of this intensity, of this magnitude, 7.5, they destroy tens of thousands of houses, and it's not uncommon to have also 20,000 people killed or more. And almost no one was killed by the shaking itself. And this is pretty interesting because Palu is made of essentially of small buildings that are just 1 to 2 stories high. And you have very few of these tall buildings like shopping malls, hotels, the university buildings also were highly damaged. And generally this is because larger buildings tend to vibrate and to respond to vibrations that are slow beats. So slow movements of the soil. And the small houses, on the contrary, they are sensible to high frequencies, and so the higher vibration and shaking. So that means that the earthquake either didn't produce these high-frequency waves, or the nature of the soil below the city basically filtered them out, or slowed down the propagation of the waves, such that we just got this low beat. And actually, the fact that most of the energy was radiated in low frequencies is consistent with this very fast unzipping, because the fault plane is smooth, and if the fault plane is smooth, that means you have very little friction during the quake on it. So the more friction you have, the more you produce these high frequency vibrations, and the more you damage the houses. So in a way, Palu was super lucky to have so few destructions to the houses. And where the city was lucky too is that after large earthquakes, you have a long series of aftershocks. And aftershocks are smaller earthquakes. It's basically a reorganization of the ground around the main area of rupture. So the part of the fault that moved is here, and you see the formation of a halo of smaller earthquakes during the following weeks. And these aftershocks are dangerous because they, on their own, they wouldn't be dangerous, but because they affect a city which is partly destroyed, they can basically destroy some buildings that have been damaged during the main event. And the second danger comes from the fact that it is nerve-wracking to have these earthquakes occurring repeatedly for weeks to people who have been traumatized by the main event. So you could have panics, and you could have people hurting themselves or killing themselves just out of panics during the following weeks. And here again, the series of aftershock was remarkably small. Like the intensity, the magnitude of these earthquakes was really small. So again, they were pretty lucky regarding that. And the last piece of luck is that we don't observe that many landslides on the mountains surrounding Palu. There are a few large landslides, but usually earthquakes are able to trigger thousands or even tens of thousands of earthquakes on mountain slopes. And I took an example from an earthquake last year in Japan, which was struck by a rather small earthquake, so a magnitude 6.6, but this happened after 4 days after the passage of the remnants of a hurricane. And due to that, the mountain soils were soaked with water. And what you see here in red are all the landslides that were triggered during the earthquake. So you see that almost 50% of the land in some areas was wasted down to the streams. And if this had happened in Palu, then basically your landslide material gets into the stream bed, is soaked with water by the river, and then is going to release large flows composed of mud and boulders, and they are going to rush in the city and destroy the district. And we have evidence for such events in the past in Palu, but we just don't know exactly why it didn't occur this time. So once again, the lack of landslide is a piece of luck. So basically, if things had stopped there, this would have been a very safe earthquake, I would say. Like only a few hundreds of people would have been killed. But actually, we probably had 4,000 people and more killed, and this is because other phenomena that are usually not very important were extremely widespread in Palu. And the first of these is liquefaction. So this is a map of the center of Palu that shows the amount of displacement of the ground due to liquefaction. So where it's green, it has not been moving. Where it's red, it has been moving up to 7 to 8 meters. And in a few areas, the ground has been completely yielding and producing large landslides. So liquefaction is produced by, basically, it means that the soil behaves like a liquid. And this is because somewhere in the ground you have the water table, which is very close to the ground surface. And you have sand layers that are soaked in water that are going to move and reorganize during the earthquake. And if you have a load of clays and buildings on top, the sand layers are going to move laterally, and the layers on top are going to move with them. And the buildings are going to sink into the ground, and if you have a slope, then you are going to have a landslide. So it is very diffuse. So these are not landslides, they are just basically deformation of the ground, which moves laterally, but you have no clear ruptures of the ground. So instead what you have, okay, this is a movie actually, it's not working, but that's fine. It's basically the ground is making large, long waves like this. And because the buildings on top are rigid, they break. They are unable to adapt to this deformation of the ground. And the city of Palu has been incredibly damaged over an extremely extensive area by this process. It has not killed many people, but of course the buildings are basically impossible to fix. Now in some areas, like here in Balaroa on the western side, we had a complete failure of the ground. So that means the districts, instead of moving a few meters, they just moved much more. And this is because there is a layer at depth between 7 and 10 meters that is used for gliding. And the soil is just going to slip over very large distances. So this is a real landslide. So the arrows show the displacement of these mosques, of these buildings here that have been displaced by up to 450 meters. And you see that some of them just moved as a group like that, and some others were just squished. So the result is this, that the houses that were here, well, basically they are still next to each other, and a few people survived the trip downslope. But of course, the people who were in the districts located at the front were completely squished due to the shortening, and we got a huge amount of stretching in the back of the landslide. This is one of the landslides from the east side of the valley, so it's more countryside, villages and rice paddies. And this is a video taken by a guy sitting on top of his roof. And so he's basically just moving down with his house. And you probably have seen this video. And you see how everything is moving together, while you have also some lateral displacement between the objects. You can also see that there's a lot of water expelled from the ground. So it's all the water that was containing the sound which is expelled at the surface. So you see that the displacement is pretty fast. It's a few meters per second. But due to the very large size of the landslide, it seems that it's moving slowly. And the local slope is only about 2 to 3 degrees. And here for scale you have this communication tower. So we're passing by the communication tower. The slide is here. It is called an earth flow because it's like a stream of earth, of soil, moving down slope. And so of course the challenge is to stay on top of the flow as it moves down if you want to survive. What you are going to see now is that basically the house is arriving in an area where the ground is stable, where this tree is. So this tree is not moving, and you see that the mud flow is just arriving on top of it and crushing on stable ground. So probably the guy was kicked out of his rooftop due to the collision. So here is what it looks like after the earth flow. So we are looking from the top of the slope down. You see that it's a very shallow slope. You just need a few degrees to trigger it. You can see that some of the trees have just been transported and staying up. Some of them are tilted. And we are actually located close to the scarp. And you see that the rice paddies have been rotated. And from this rotation we can tell that the sliding layer is at a depth of 5 to 7 meters. And with geologists we went to study these soils, and what you see here is what the ground is made of. And you have an alternation of clay, sand and gravel, and the most interesting layers are these dark layers here, because these are composed of a fine sand which is very homogeneous. And it is this type of layer soaked with water which is going to be the gliding plane for these earthquakes. But for this, and this probably was the layer that moved in this case is located farther down here. So to do so though, so you need to be able to do these earth flows and liquefaction, you have to be generally between 5 and 10 meters below the ground surface. Below you have too much pressure for it to happen. And you need these layers to be quite close to the surface, and you need to have them soaked with water. And this can only happen if the water table is close to the ground surface. So generally these liquefaction are observed along rivers in the flat plains that are totally flat. And it's not supposed to happen here because we are on the side of the valley where the water table is normally located at the depth of 15 to 20 meters. So it is too deep normally to trigger an earth flow. And what really struck us, I was at the time in Banda Aceh working with Dedi Alfian, who is doing his PhD on soil liquefaction. And we noticed, and our colleagues in Palu noticed it independently, and also people at the Earth Observatory in Singapore. They observed that the liquefaction, which is represented by the arrows here, occurred systematically below an aqueduct used for irrigation on the side of the valley. So clearly there is a sharp contrast between the slopes located above, which have not been moving, and the slopes below that have been moving over several kilometers of distance from the aqueduct, and areas that correspond to the big earth flows that we saw. And the image to the left shows you actually this scarp here. And it shows the canal, which is dry now, with two roads on either side, a bottom made of clay, over 20 centimeters, and then the natural soil below. So either through leakage from the canal or just from irrigation from it, the area to the left had a water table which was within 2 meters from the ground surface. So basically, irrigation was responsible for triggering the earth flows. So this was published recently in Nature Geoscience. And we have other cases, like the first landslide that occurred in town that I was showing here. It is located just on the left of the Palu-Koro fault, and as we can see, it is also located in an area of strong liquefaction, shown here in red. And we see that the areas of liquefaction are not random, but they seem to start at a specific point along the slope here. And if we go to the field in this area, at the head of the landslide, this is what we see. We have a street, which is basically the head of the landslide, and we have a canal for the evacuation of stormwater nearby. However, this canal is very small, so we are not sure whether it is sufficient to keep the water table high. There are other hypotheses to explain that. But once again, there is a strong localization of liquefaction. There are areas that are more normal for encountering liquefaction, especially the coast, because at the coast you have seawater, and the fresh water is meeting the seawater close to the ground surface. And if you have soft soils, for example, areas where rivers have been pouring sand, then you are going to have liquefaction occurring too. And this is a case, we were on a boat and we were mapping the seafloor in this area, and this is a village on the eastern coast. And what you see is that the ground has been stretching, spreading during the earthquake towards the sea, and this led to the submersion of the former shoreline. And as you can see, this is a case of diffuse deformation, and in other places then it's going to yield and fail, producing landslides. And this is in the harbor of Donggala, where we have also a river riding here, and we had houses built on these soft sediments, and they collapsed into the sea, and at least 20 people were drowned here. And we mapped and found the houses to be at a depth of 10 to 15 meters below sea level. So, since we moved to the sea, now we come to the most tricky part of this earthquake, which is the fact that we had a tsunami. And this came to a surprise, because initially, as you saw, the rupture was mostly on land. So the fault, the 180 kilometers, it is only crossing the sea over a distance of 20 kilometers. So, and because it is two blocks passing by each other, it is not supposed to produce much displacement of seawater, except if the seafloor is very rough. But you probably have seen this video before. So this is the arrival of the tsunami wave. But I would like you to notice first that the sea retreated and exposed this mud flat, and that the streets at the front had already been flooded, either by small waves before, or by just the collapse of the ground that I was showing you previously. And so it is already inundated by water. The houses are destroyed partly because of the earthquake. And so when the wave hits, in this area it has a height of 5 meters, and it is rushing at 7 meters per second into the sea. So what you see on the right is an early simulation of the tsunami. So the simulation considers that the tsunami started here in the middle of the bay and formed a dome of water. So on this map, what you are going to see, so we are looking towards the inside of the city. So the tsunami has been slowing down very quickly. And the mosque here had been destroyed before. It's not due to the tsunami, it's due to ground shaking before the wave. So of course, because it hit 3 minutes after the earthquake, of course, a warning system would be meaningless in the bay, because basically the earthquake is the signal that something can happen. So what we're going to look at here is how the tsunami, if it formed here, how it propagated across the bay. So the areas in blue correspond to areas where the sea has been going down, and in red where it has been going up. So you see the dome forming here, and then the dome collapses, and two waves are sent to the north, where it's going to dissipate in the sea, and it's going to focus and concentrate on Palu in the south. And after that, the waves are going to bounce back and forth across the bay, which is going, or the water is going to slosh back and forth, like in a bathtub, for many minutes after. So because of that, we got many waves, and it is really hard to just understand the origin of the tsunami by interviewing people and asking where the waves were coming from, because depending where we were along the bay, you will have a different experience. You will see the waves coming from the right, from the left, 1 minute after the earthquakes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, it will change everywhere you are. And just making the problem more complex, you have the height of the tsunamis is highly sensitive on the shape of the coast. So we hired a boat in the port of Donggala, which is 30 kilometers from Palu, because all the boats had been destroyed in the bay. And we went mapping the seafloor very close to places where we did sampling for the tsunami deposits, because one of our objectives is to study the deposits. And what you see here are big coral heads that have been taken from the seafloor here and dumped on the platform. You see rocks, you see coral branches and sand and mud. And just a few kilometers from this site, you have this bay, which has a protective coral reef and a mangrove, and you see that strictly nothing happened. Same here, farther north, this village with the houses just next to the sea, you see absolutely no impact of the tsunami, and this is due to a protective coral reef over here. So all this makes it very complex to model the tsunami. And of course there is the origin of the tsunami. So luckily enough, the BPPT had been mapping the seafloor a few years ago, I think it's 2014, and they produced a bathymetric map of the bay, which is quite precise. And what is pretty remarkable about Palu is that the city is here, and this is the bay. The bay is 30 kilometers long, it is 6 to 8 kilometers wide, and it is incredibly deep. Over most of its length, it has a depth of more than 700 meters, which is extremely rare outside of glacial areas. And so, of course, because the earthquake was mostly on land, and geologists were not expecting a tsunami, people started thinking, well, you know, if you have such a steep slope on either side, and then you have these rivers pouring sediments on the slope. So just imagine the rivers are releasing gravel, pebbles, sand on these very steep slopes, very unstable slopes. So you would expect that during an earthquake, you will trigger landslides below the sea. And so everyone thought at the start, oh yes, of course, it has to be landslides somewhere below sea level. However, they came to, and this is what people were thinking here, but there was a second hypothesis, which is that actually what ruptured initially during the earthquake is not the Palu-Koro fault itself, which runs here, but it's another fault that people didn't know. And during the rupture, at some point, it connected to the real Palu-Koro faults and continued south. So there is a jump here across the bay. And this creates a complexity which could be responsible for the deformation of the seafloor. And we have clear evidences of past large landslides, like here, and we have some others there. So we know that we can indeed have very large tsunamis produced by landslides. But the remapping of the bay didn't say that. So this is a view of the seafloor, looking from the north to the south towards Palu. The fault is on this side of the bay. And the patches here are the differences between the floor before the earthquake and after the earthquake. And what you see is the vertical drop. And what they found is that the drop of the bay altogether dropped by several meters, up to 5 meters. So that means the tsunami could have been triggered by the inflow of the water towards the center of the bay, and then its rebound towards the coastline. So, as you can see, it's a very rich earthquake with a very unexpected phenomena occurring and others not occurring. And of course, there are some lessons we can take from this earthquake that are quite obvious. The first one is that since now we know where the fault is located in town, the first thing to do is, of course, to not build on top. It's not always easy. I've been fighting in Guatemala, people building on top of an active fault, and it's very hard to do. And so, for example, in California, the San Andreas fault, you cannot build over 100 meters on either side of the fault. So maybe that's too much for Palu, but at least you could establish a corridor into which you cannot construct anything. You could also design bridges that are flexible, meaning they are able to rotate during the earthquake. That way you can avoid interrupting the roads. As to the ground shaking, Palu has been lucky, probably, that there was not a lot of energy radiated in high frequencies, and this prevented many houses from collapsing. So what would happen is that if the city keeps growing, we'll have more and more of these high-story, multi-story buildings, and therefore the city might become more vulnerable to the next earthquake. And because of the frequency of these earthquakes, okay, the return period seems to be 50 years. That means that that's about the lifetime of the buildings that we would build today. So that means that whatever you build today, which is high, is very likely to experience the next earthquake. So it's very important to implement paraseismic rules to prevent the collapse of these buildings. As regarded the earth flows, well, we know that the cause is anthropogenic, so we can directly act on that by controlling the level of the water table. So one option is, which is very radical, is just to stop irrigating the slopes. And something that would be less damaging to the local economy could be just to adapt to fragment the rice fields, so that the water table comes to the surface only here and then, and in between to have a mix of other agricultural practices and occupations that don't require so much water. And this could prevent the generation of large earth flows. As for the ones occurring in the city, of course, one way is to monitor the water table to make sure that there is not too much leakage from reticulated water from storm channels. And another way is to drain, so to actually introduce pipe and drain the water table to make sure that it's never close to the ground surface. Tsunamis, well, so there were at least 4 tsunamis in the past century. It didn't prevent people from rebuilding at the coast. One option with the tsunami is, of course, we could use the modern tsunami to establish rules to construct a wall or something. But if you remember Fukushima, basically the nuclear plant was protected by a wall, which was just not high enough for this tsunami, because they had not planned that they would get such a large tsunami. And the issue in the Bay of Palu is that the tsunamis, they can be produced by local earthquakes, but in the past century they were also produced by earthquakes occurring at sea, farther to the north, and these earthquakes produced tsunami that migrated into the bay. And as you saw, the bay is just like a tunnel, and this tsunami came to hit Palu. So these ones are pretty easy to model. The ones that occur during the bay, it's more complicated. Because what happens if there is a large landslide, for example? The tsunami height would be much higher than what an earthquake would produce. So in that case, you know, the first question is, are they frequent? So we need to study how often these large landslides occur during the day, which requires some geological studies. Another important question is, can we just use the last earthquake to mitigate the next one? Because is the next one going to be like this earthquake? Because if we look in the past, for example, the last earthquake of this magnitude, which was 1964, I think, it was very different. It didn't activate the main faults, it activated other faults. It seems it was more damaging to houses. So it means that maybe not every earthquake is the same on the fault. So we need to study better the last earthquakes that occurred, maybe the 10 last earthquakes, to understand how normal it is to have an earthquake like the one that just occurred. Because we might be just preparing for an earthquake with low frequencies of seismic waves, and the next one will have high frequencies. And maybe it will strike on other faults. And maybe it will trigger landslides on the mountain slopes. If it happens, for example, at a different time during the year, when the soils are soaked with water, then this is a phenomenon that didn't occur at all in this case, and it might be very problematic in the future. And we could have these flows of mud and boulders just rushing into the city hours after the earthquakes. So that's why it is important to do investigations of the past. And for this we can rely on sociologists to interview people about the 1964 earthquakes and some previous earthquakes and tsunamis, historians to look into the archives, to see when the tsunamis occurred farther back in the past, as well as the earthquakes. And when you need to go farther back in time, you need to do geological studies by looking at the deposits left by these events all around the valley. So it's not very uplifting, but that's what I had to say today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Gilles, for your presentation. It's now time for the Q&A session, so if you have any question, please raise your hand and I will give you the mic. No question?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Henki. I'm coming from University of Lampung. Okay, for the spatial planning, yeah, for the spatial planning in the mitigation process, is it possible to estimate or mapping the high risk zone of liquefaction?
Well, we know, we can use the mapping that has been done during this earthquake. We see that the areas are really located below the irrigation channels on one side, and below a limit which is well defined on the west side, if we don't know exactly where. For sure, liquefaction is due to the water table being high, but of course it can only exert itself if the soil is adapted to liquefaction. So we have alluvial fans that have this very well sorted sand, which is susceptible to liquefaction. If you have a high water table in a place where the soil is made of big boulders, nothing is going to occur, right? So it is really what people do generally for mapping the risk is to cross-cut information regarding the height of the water table, the type of soil, and the peak ground acceleration you expect at these places. So I would say you can totally, what happened during the earthquake help us know what are the most sensitive areas along these slopes, for sure. And also, I would say, if the wells are monitored, you can say whether we are out of danger or still in danger of liquefaction during the next earthquake.
What kind is the soil that we have to pay attention for liquefaction?
So what you need to pay attention for is sands, fine sands to medium-sized sands, generally the most common case, that are well sorted, meaning they have a very similar size of grains. And especially when the sands are trapped below a layer, an impermeable layer above them, like a clay layer, for example. Because what happens during the quake is that the sand is going to reorganize to become more compact. So if your soil has no water, or little water, the ground is just going to go down. But if your pores between the grains are completely filled with water, that means that when the grain collapses, your clay layer is sitting on water. So it's like a waterbed. And so any constraint on any side is going to make it move, basically. And because the ground is shaking, it's basically a sliding topsoil on top of water.
Okay, thank you. One last question, please. There is a viral information from the media a couple of days ago. We have a high-risk area, high-risk tsunami area in the subduction zone in the south of Java Island. And my attention is for in the south of Sunda Strait. Yeah, in the south of Sunda Strait. What do you think about?
I suppose that, so it is true that following the big earthquake of 2004, we had a migration of earthquakes progressively from North Sumatra to the south, all along the coast. So the idea is that each time you have a patch of the subduction zone that moves, it stresses the patches located farther along the chain. And the idea is that probably this area is highly stressed right now, so they are expecting an earthquake due to that. After, I suppose, they made calculations and modeling of what a tsunami would look like, I suppose they are expecting a magnitude of potentially 8 or higher.
Yeah, because there's some research from Video Conco from the PPT that there is a high potential tsunami in the south of Java, West Java. And do you agree with this statement?
I don't know I didn't read the papers about this area, so I'm not knowledgeable enough to answer this question. I've been working in Banda Aceh more, and what is interesting there is that I would say people have been, of course, traumatized by the tsunami, and when they think of risk, they think of the tsunami. The thing is that there is the Sumatra fault, which is very similar to the Palu-Koro fault, and it passes below and next to Banda Aceh. And this fault has not been moving for a long time. Yeah. And due to the earthquake, we know that this part of the fault zone is highly stressed. So the most likely risk in the future is an earthquake, very much like in Palu, occurring next to Banda Aceh. And of course, it is not the danger that people see, because they have the tsunami, so they think, okay, this is a big danger. But actually, the next tsunami will probably occur much after the next earthquake, for which no one is really prepared. Which is why my colleague Didier Clian is studying the risk of liquefaction, because this is actually a more pressing issue at the moment. But so I think it is the highest risk, because indeed it is probably a patch of the subduction zone that has been stressed by the other earthquakes, and they probably have a record of past events, and they see that it has not moved for a long time, which means that it is probably going to move quite soon. I'm assuming that's the reasoning behind.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any other question?
Hamid, my name. I have a question. We have here what you tell us that 3 different kind of happening. Yeah. Is there any possibility that we could have more damage as this 3 different kind happening in one case in Palu?
So excuse me, I don't see you actually. I have a So you say, could we have the 3 damages occurring all at once?
In case of Palu, we have these 3 different kinds, right?
Yes, yes.
Is it also possible that be more, 4, 5, or even more different kind of happening?
I suppose you could have an earthquake which is more damaging for the houses, that also triggers landslides on the mountain flats. I don't know if such an earthquake would trigger liquefaction. It could certainly trigger a tsunami. So I don't know if you could have all of them together, but you could have more.
Hi, my name is Sri. So I was interested in the liquefaction phenomena because it's something that is rare, and there is a very minimum research upon that. So do you have any hypothesis why the liquefaction is actually scattered? If you see the map, that it's completely happening in 3 different areas, such as Petobo, Jonogi in the southern part, and the eastern part is in Balaroa. So it's completely different and very scattered, so there's no pattern in that. So because the majority of area is actually sediment, supposedly our logic would say, okay, it's supposed to be happening everywhere, it's ubiquitous. But unfortunately, fortunately it only happened in 3 areas. So do you have any hypothesis why it happened in that particular area, and what parameter that actually contributes to such disasters? And my second question is how to actually minimize the impact of liquefaction if you happen to be in that area. Thank you.
So, do you want to go back? I'm not sure it wants. No, okay. As you saw from the map, actually the liquefaction is the diffuse deformation of the soil, right? So it was actually happening in many places, but only in 3 places. Actually, there are some other farther south. You got a big landslide. And the areas where the landslide took place are the places where you got the most deformation of the ground due to liquefaction. So you have a diffuse displacement of the ground from 1 to 6, 7 meters. But as you go close to the landslide, that's where you have the largest displacement, 6, 7 meters. And it seems that it is a threshold beyond which the soil cannot stand so much displacement. It fails, and there you get the big landslides. Now, why it happened at these very specific places? The places where you see the largest amount of displacement are the places where you have the continuous rice paddies. So, where it is more fragmented or where you have forest, you see that liquefaction stops. So these are places where people have been watering the fields, which by trickling down, it's transmitted to these sand layers that are below. So, of course, mitigation is that if you stop irrigating, you don't have this issue, because liquefaction will always occur in a floodplain next to a river where it's flat, because you cannot prevent the water table from being there. But it is less damaging there. That's where it occurs naturally. It doesn't occur on slopes like that, because the water table is deeper below these slopes. So when you are in a real floodplain, you get a sort of spreading of the ground towards the river, and you have the buildings sinking into the floodplain. But you don't see these big earth flows because there is no slope. So normally, if liquefaction is natural, you don't trigger these very large landslides, because it's not supposed to occur where you have slopes, because there the water table is deep. So in this case, it's really because we are in an artificial situation where we have been watering the slopes, and we had a high water table. This is what allowed for the formation of these slides. Now, very specifically, why we got landsliding at these very specific spots, I'm not sure. We could look if they also correspond to the area of the maximum density of rice paddies. I know that there is a relationship between their density and the amount of diffuse liquefaction, but where you have the highest one, I'm not sure if there is a specific density threshold beyond which they occurred. We have not been that far yet into the investigation. But what we suggest in this paper, which was published, is that if you don't have a continuity of rice fields across the landscape, that means these soap layers, right, that are at depth, are not watered all the way. So that means you can have a slope that starts slipping somewhere and another one slipping somewhere else, but they are not connected. So you are not going to have a massive landslide occurring for the landscape.
Someone else?
How to minimize other impact?
Minimize other impacts? Minimizing the impact. That's complicated. Like if you have a constriction, you have two options when you have an earthquake. Either you make your house extremely rigid, so it's going to be a block. If it is in the landslide, there is not much you can do. If it's just diffuse liquefaction, then you will have a box moving like that. So you might have a part of the house sticking up and another sticking. You can maybe still live in it if it's not tilted too much. But it is an option. You have two responses to. If you have a small constriction, you tend to make it rigid, so that it is not destroyed by the quake. But as soon as you have something bigger, what you want is something very flexible, a very flexible structure, which is going to, with the columns that are disconnected from the walls, so that they are free to move during the earthquake, and that way you don't damage the very structure that is holding the house. So you will damage the walls, but the house will not collapse, and at least you will save lives. You might have to tear down the building afterwards, but at least you will have saved the people inside. So that's the best you can do, I would say. Either being flexible or super rigid, but only at a small size. But if you have an airflow, there is not much you can do to mitigate it. Yeah.
Have you finished with her answer that question? Okay. I'm Juli, I come from Bogor, and I think your research is very interesting, especially in Indonesia. Indonesia, not like Japan, but we have facing many disasters, I think.
Yes.
From hard wind like storm, we have earthquake, we have flood, we have other landslide and others. For this time, your subject is about earthquake. I just I have two questions for you. The first is, we will facing the earthquake in the next time, but we know, well, we don't know about the time, and we don't know where it will come. And then I will ask you a question about what kind of specific education that can you recommend to Indonesian people to educate to all of people, from children until to old men, yes, to educate. I think part of mitigating is education to facing the disaster, yes, and in this even is earthquake, I think. Mm-hmm. I just ask you a question about what kind of specific education that can teach to all people in Indonesia, I think, because the disaster come to all, not to children, not to adults. And the next question is something I think is slightly so different from first question. Indonesia will choose new next Jakarta, the new capital. We will find another place to replace Jakarta, and we will like Brasilia for Brazil, you know. We will choose another place for replace the capital for our nation. And you think where is the good place and the best place to avoid earthquake for the next Jakarta for Indonesia? That's my question. Two questions, I think.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I will answer to the second one first. It's shorter. I think the plan is to move it to Kalimantan, right? Well, it's the best decision. Regarding just the earthquakes, I'm not talking about other aspects. I'm just saying Yes. For the earthquake, it's a very wise decision.
Kalimantan is the very wise.
Yeah, it's the most stable part. So it's the farthest from the main quake. So yeah, definitely it's a good option.
Because President Soekarno have considered about Kalimantan to before, I think 40 years ago. Or
Yes, but from a pure geological point of view, it's a very good idea.
Kalimantan is a good place, certainly.
Yes. Only on this aspect. I don't comment about the rest. Yeah.
The first question.
Then now for the first question.
Yeah. What kind of education? It's hard, I think.
Well, I have some experience of it from because I worked in Guatemala, where we were trying to educate people about earthquakes. And there are several things, of course, like there are habits you can teach to students at school, which is to plunge below the tables, to protect themselves from falling walls, falling objects. So you can educate people to the first reflexes you must have when there is an earthquake. Now, when it comes to building, you know, people think that building earth-proof, or at least, you know, earth slightly resistant building is expensive. But actually, it's not. If you are not trying to save the entire structure, you have very simple things to do that won't save every building, but you will lower the percentage of destruction considerably by very simple things. And actually, they produced manuals, especially in India, that are called Guide to Non-Engineered Constructions, which means if you are building even with dirt or with bricks, there are better ways than others. Of course, it will be always better to, not always, but it might be better to use concrete. But if you don't have this chance, there are still things to do that improve your building, and they are very inexpensive. And for example, when you cast concrete, there are very simple things to do, like, I don't really know the name of that in English, but when you want to hold the irons together, you are using these square things.
Oh, you're using iron?
Yeah, but so in the iron, when you use these square things to try to hold the vertical ones, if you just twist them slightly farther inside, it avoids the columns from exploding during an earthquake. It's a very simple gesture, you just do that instead of just that. And I think it increases the resistance by 70%. So, you know, just training the local masons, you know, to do that. That's an example, but there are many examples of little things that can really improve and lower the damage without having to resort to engineers and sophisticated ways. But there has been a lot of research published about that. Now, when it comes to passing the information, you shouldn't let people like me do that, because you need sociologists to do so. Because there were some disasters in the past. I had colleagues in Guatemala who decided to launch campaigns of mitigation, you know, explain to people, and very quickly the rumors ran that there was going to be an earthquake. Because otherwise, why would these people be there? And so when they were being asked, so is there going to be an earthquake soon? And you try to explain, we know where the earthquakes are going to happen, we just don't know when. They were thinking they lie, they are just hiding something to us, because otherwise, why would they do that now? You know? So you need to be very careful in the way you deliver the information and through which network you pass the information to avoid panics and distortion of the information. And the role of sociologists is very important there. Yeah.
Okay, but I think it's not only from the structure of the building to avoid the disaster, the earthquake, I think.
Yes, of course, it's preparing the people, training the people. That's pretty easy to do.
You know, in Indonesia we have, we have a low education people in Indonesia, much uneducated, I think, maybe, and few people in Indonesia. I don't know, I think how you can facing the people like that to tell them about the solution to go and to take a safe place when disaster comes.
Well, I would think you have enough disasters for people to know there is a danger.
Because we have not only earthquake, we have flood, we have
Yes.
storm, we have much this and that.
Yes, it's not a simple issue because sometimes in Guatemala people say, well, you know, if I died, it's God's will.
Okay.
Yeah. You know?
Sorry. I think we have like a lot of other questions.
Ah.
I'm really sorry, but you can continue the conversation after in the lobby. Okay.
Okay.
I only have one question. So I come from Banda Aceh and I just finished my bachelor's studies in sociology in Geneva, Switzerland. We know that sociologically Indonesian people, most of them, and a lot of them, they believe that a natural catastrophe is caused either because of sins or because a superior creator wants them to, to come back to the religion. I think my question would add to educational aspect. And how do you think it will affect the future public acceptance for settlement policies in the future? Because we know that earthquakes per se don't kill people, but settlements do.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, it's true. We always say a catastrophe is like an earthquake to the natural environment. It's called a disturbance of the natural environment. It's only a catastrophe for humans. And how to deal with that? Well, you are the sociologist here, I would say. I had pretty bad experiences in Guatemala regarding this aspect. And this had to do with places where people were suspicious about us and didn't let us study a fault. And we were explaining to them they were very selfish because they prevented us from bringing important information for everyone around. Well, their answer was to build a church right on top of the fault and to say we will just pray and it won't move. Right? So I would say if you, I don't know, you can tell me in sociology if you can just tell people, okay, you will be punished, but maybe you can lower the punishment by, jumping below the table. But, you have to find ways. I would tell you in Guatemala, people say that they believe pretty much the same thing. They believe in big snakes underground, and they believe that sometimes they are moving because of bad actions of people at the surface. And you can just run with it. Why not? I mean, I had ceremonies on top of my trenches, where they invoked the spirits to make sure, the earth would be happy with our trenching. Yeah, whatever it takes, to make it work.
Sir, excuse me, I want to ask one question about Petobo, Palu.
Yes.
How many years more will be recovery for you approximately Petobo? Yeah? Because before is for house living. Yeah? And what kind of project good for that area because it's after horrible disaster. That's it from me. Thank you.
Well, I have colleagues from Palu in the room, I think. Maybe they can answer that better than me.
Okay, good evening. Yeah. My name is Dr. Sukiman Nirdin. I was being invited here to attend the presentation. Okay, thank you for the presentations. Very good presentation this evening. First of all, before I answer the question, there are a lot of things I want to tell this evening. First of all, about the liquefaction area. There was just a 4 big liquefaction area in 2 in Palu and 2 in Sigi district. Okay, but there was about 6 or 7 the little liquefaction areas here, just 1 hectare, 500 meter square in area Palu and in the Sigi. but just four, the big one, had been exploited. Yeah, I want to say, as you said, there was four big liquefaction festival in Petobo, Balaroa, Jonooge, and Sibalaya. The three areas in Petobo, Sibalaya, and Jonooge have a different liquefaction system, because there is a canal irrigation in the top side. It was built in Netherlands era about 1937. The festival was within the irrigation canal and was be recovered by JICA in 1937. Okay, it's a long of the canal irrigation was built a very long time, and the canal irrigation was built by the just air canal. There is no flooring over there. No walls over there, so I agree with you. The canal irrigation was very influence of the liquefaction system. And now the Palu city, the government of the Palu city and Sigi city have agreed to not to resettlement of the people who have already stay over there, because there are still of bodies buried over there. About in Petobo, about maybe still 150,000 people buried over there, the bodies. So people agreed to empty the area and make the area to be like a park. Yeah, like a park and RTH. That's mean RTH or yeah, for the people. There will be built about a monument, liquefaction monument in that area. There's our money to rebuild again for this for resettlement. So people who save over there will be resettlement in another area in the north area of the Palu near to the Tadulako University. Yeah, there was about 150 hectare area for the people who affected by the liquefaction. Okay, and yeah, as you say, there was a lot of story about the earthquake happened in Palu before the 2018. The big one is 1907, then and 2 years after 1909. Yeah, there is still a record in Palu. The simplification or the amplification of earthquakes look like same as the just early happened. Yeah, even the coconut tree. And people who standing will be fall, yeah. And then after that, people in Palu Valley was moved to the hilly side. Okay, at the time in the history, and just maybe few villages still standing. Yeah? We said all villages now. And when the earthquake happened in the last earthquake in last years. They're still not really damaged by the earthquake. But in the about 1953, people around the central Sulawesi, like in the south of Sulawesi, north of Sulawesi, in Gorontalo and west of Sulawesi, came and resettlement in Palu. Then they don't know about the mitigation of the earthquake in Palu city. And they just buy the land and build the house. But for the local people, it was banned before. That's happened why in the liquefaction area was banned to build the house at the time, because it's a swamp area. But because the limitation of the area, because the people just come in yeah, just come in, and the city was very crowded. The people just wait in that area that been banned before. Okay, so when the earthquake happened, yeah, so liquefaction was happened because the building was a lot of building like in your picture. Yeah, before the place that we banned, but because the swamp over there, so people just build the house, and when the earthquake happened, and the liquefaction just happened, and according to the old people, the liquefaction just happened not just at the moment when the last year is okay, but happened at the earthquakes before. Okay, so people, local people, they have language about the liquefaction. They call nalodo. Yeah, nalodo. There's a local language.
So regarding the question, so people are being relocated.
Yeah,
not at the university.
Yeah.
Right. But so that means they have to abandon their cultures.
Yeah.
So do you know what they are going to live off?
Okay. Yeah.
Do we know?
Yeah. As I say, the people, government was build the permanent house. Yeah. Then helped by the a lot of foundation from the outside and the inside of the Indonesia. They build, even the Jakarta government, they build 500 house in Palu for the resettlement. Yeah, another like in west of Java and east of Java, they about 100 house they rebuild for the resettlement. Yeah.
So the landslide area will be converted to forest.
Yeah, to the forest. Yeah, city forest. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe one. Okay.
Just
questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, my name is Christian. I'm from UNDP. It's very interesting finding from your study about the trigger of the tsunami. I mean, it actually confirms some of the understanding whether it's caused by the submarine landslide. But it seems like from your presentation, it confirms the understanding that it actually come from the subduction of the seabed. If I'm mistaken. Just
yes,
to confirm that, whether
yes,
it's landslide or subduction.
It just went down.
It's went down, right? Okay, so it means that it's more like a subduction rather than... Yeah, contribute with several part of the landslide. So, yes, then of course it triggers the water, deformation of the water along the fault areas and also on the Palu Bay. So, yes, that's basically just to confirm that. And the second part is actually I've been hearing all the discussion about the disaster management and also about the risk of the tsunami. Can you go back to the first slide when you present the fault lines within the countries? If I may say, I think there's a map before this. Yes, this actually. So this is pretty much we would like to confirm the question whether there is a potential of high risk disaster within the country. I mean, not to supersede what you presented, but actually just to share some of the understanding and the opinions that Indonesia is sitting in these fault lines, unfortunately, and the risk of tsunami, earthquake, and other type of geological disaster is immense within the country. So the challenge what we have in the country, within the country, is to ensure whether the capacity of the communities and the understanding of the communities on the risk is sufficient enough to cope with the existing condition we have in our country. That's the biggest challenge. Why? Because first, investing on disaster risk management is like the analogy is actually like if you purchase an insurance. You purchase something that actually you don't want to use it. It's just like an aspect of a contingency type of input for yourself, but you are investing on something that you don't expect to happen, right? So for the government side, it's a bit challenging in terms of investing the government development fund to invest for something that a little bit difficult to measure. How to measure preparedness, for instance, how to measure the capacity. That's difficult. So it's a huge homework, not just with the government, also with the society. And it's also come back to us as part of the society to understand what are the contexts of our environment. And also, interesting part is actually we discuss about the sociology aspect. It's actually abundant traditional knowledge within the country that has actually already experienced this kind of disaster. We're talking about Aceh. There's in Isimalu there is a local term that called smog, right? In Palu Center for instance, Palu areas, Balarua areas that experience the liquefaction actually mean water catchment area. So it's actually explained from the local wisdom. There is a certain knowledge that already there, but people has the tendency to forget what are the local wisdom are. So the challenge is now how we can identify that and use that to empower our communities.
Yeah.
That's only my share of view.
Thank you. I think it's really important that it comes from the government, though, because I have seen it outsourced to NGOs. And the issue is that if you outsource such management to NGOs, first of all, it undermines the authority of the local government. And also, because it is not coordinated, you can run into, there is not a global view of the various risks that are there. I was confronted to situations where I met an NGO, which with goodwill was telling people, okay, if you have a big hurricane, you should take shelter in the school, because it's the safest building in the village. Problem is that I saw the school was just next to a small stream, and there was a big landslide further up in the catchment. So that meant the school was about to be destroyed by mud flows in case of hurricane. And the NGO was basically telling people to go in the school that would be taken by the mud flows. And this is because they just had a scheme that they were applying everywhere, regardless of the context. So you need to have governmental agencies that are able to coordinate such decisions and such training that have the ability to have this broad vision of the risk. You see, and this has to be really done at the governmental level. Otherwise, it's quickly a mess.
I think there is another question.
Yes. My name is Sarah Adila. I'm a filmmaker from Palu. Currently, I and other filmmakers from Palu is working on our documentaries about mitigation disasters. And because we see after disaster, there are so many researchers come to our city and do their research. But the irony is, most of local people there still didn't know the knowledge of what was happened on the 28th of September. Because to be honest, after the disaster happened, my generation, we are from Palu, realized that we are lack of history and knowledge about our city. And we didn't know about our city and its natural phenomena that related to its toponymy. For example, as Palu in a local language, meaning is uplifting land, and several places like Balarua that have been mentioned before. Bala means big tragedy, and Roa means massive in the local Kaili language. So in here, to be honest, I'm not questioning anything. I just want to ask, by any chance, if I could build a connection between maybe you and the geological data, so it can be helpful for us to produce into a film that people in Palu can understand to watch, because this is very important for us in the future. Thank you.
Oh, sure, I would be pleased to do that, but I would remind you that you're a university with people who are very talented and knowledgeable also, who can and who are actually way more knowledgeable than I am about the specificity of Palu regarding these issues, and that you can turn towards them. A few foreign researchers, like I'm very new to Palu, you know, but I have some French colleagues who have been working for 15 years there. But of course, you know, when there is no catastrophe, people have little interest in this, because they always think it will happen to another generation. It will not happen to them. You know, it's what we were talking about. Like when you try to invest in knowledge, when the catastrophe just happened, yes, people see that it is important. And so I think it's right to do it now, because in a few years from now people will forget. And the fact is that Palu is struck by catastrophes very frequently. I mean, I was surprised to see that even in Banda Aceh, the memory of the tsunami is fading very quickly. So people really forget rapidly what the catastrophe is. And in places where it's not happening so frequently, they just think that, oh yeah, it will be another generation. And it's the same for volcanoes. So it's always hard to pass an information when you say, you know, if you tell people, oh, they say, oh yes, we are going to have an earthquake. When is this going to happen? You say, we don't know. It could be tomorrow. It could be in 100 years. Ah, why do we bother? You know, like it's in 100 years from now. Yes, but it could be tomorrow. That's the issue. But it's always very hard to pass the emergency, to stay alert regarding these things. And that's why often scientists, you don't even try to pass it necessarily, because people won't be interested until there is a catastrophe, and then they are interested.
Maybe one last question?
Thank you. My name is Irfan. I'm from North Jakarta. I just want to know, the liquefaction happened in Palu, plays big role of the disaster. As we know, the liquefaction caused by the soft layer in the soil structure. Is there any effective for soil improvement to make it for building in the top of that layer, such as I think basic compaction is not enough. Maybe is there a special treatment for the soil to prevent the liquefaction in the future? Thank you.
Well, the best way is to make sure the water table is not close to the surface. So if you are on a slope, it's very easy to do. But in most cases where liquefaction occurs naturally, places that are not irrigated, it's going to be on very flat ground. And what you can try to do is to keep the water table low, but it can be very hard to do, because you might have to pump a lot of water to succeed. I mean, people have been trying to have, you know, very deep foundations, so to have pillars, you know, going very deep in the ground, several tens of meters, to stabilize the ground. That's one thing you can do, but it's extremely expensive. So the best way is to not construct there, basically.
Thank you again, Gilles Brocard, for your presentation, and thank you all for coming tonight. I know there is some other question, but you can continue this conversation outside over some snacks. And before you go, I hope to see you for our next conference, which will be on the 21st of August. Thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thank you.